Welcome to the Sunday Signal. I'm David Richards, technology entrepreneur, co-founder of Yorkshire AI Labs, and weekly columnist for the Yorkshire Post. This is issue 68 for Sunday, the 23rd of August, 2026. Today's title: The queue is not a plan. Amazon says it cannot build enough capacity to meet all the cloud demand in front of it through 2027. Britain has at least 80 gigawatts of proposed data center demand waiting for grid connections. Renting compute has not stopped making sense. It has stopped being automatic. For 15 years, the logic of enterprise computing ran one way. Do not own the machine. Rent it, because somebody with more capital will always own it more cheaply than you can. That advice built the largest businesses in the world. This is the quarter it stopped being automatic, and almost nobody has noticed what that does to a balance sheet. Today, 5 things. First, what Amazon Web Services actually said about capacity, and the 3 things the coverage has got wrong about it. Second, Britain's grid connection queue, and why China's position is weaker than the headlines suggest. Third, the ownership question, with real numbers on what a NVIDIA DGX system costs, what the license costs on top, and where the maths turns. Fourth, an Oxford company that thinks the answer is needing less power rather than finding more. And fifth, my Yorkshire Post column on where artificial intelligence will eventually live, plus the layoff tracker. 2026 has now passed last year's full year total, with 4 months still to run, and this week's numbers contain a pattern that has very little to do with failing companies. If you are not yet subscribed, the newsletter is free every Sunday at thesundaysignal.ai. That is thesundaysignal.ai. And if you are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube, please follow the show. It takes 10 seconds and it genuinely helps. Right, let's get into it. Picture a letter from your electricity supplier. The meter still works, it says, but there is not enough power to sell you everything you have asked for this year, nor next year. The list for 2028 is filling. You would not call that a growth story, you would call it a shortage. Amazon Web Services described exactly that on the 30th of July, and the market called it a triumph. Andy Jassy told shareholders that AWS cannot build enough capacity to meet all the demand in front of it in 2026. He expects the constraint to persist through 2027, with most of the capacity being added for that year already reserved, and said substantial reservations extend into 2028, describing that advanced demand in a single word: striking. Now, a note on whose numbers these are, because the coverage has blurred them and the distinction changes the argument. Amazon, the group, reported revenue of $200.6 billion for the quarter, up 20%, with operating income of $27.5 billion, up 43%. AWS is one segment inside that. Revenue of $42.2 billion, up 36.7%, and operating income of $16.6 billion. So the cloud division supplies roughly a fifth of Amazon's revenue and about 3/5 of its operating profit. That ratio explains why AWS sits at the center of Amazon's capital allocation. The shortage is the division's, the checkbook is the group's. The segment numbers are strong on their own terms. That 36.7% is the 5th consecutive quarter of acceleration and the fastest rate in 18 quarters, back when AWS was less than half its present size. The backlog stands at $496 billion, growing at triple digits. The chips business and the AI business have each passed $25 billion in annual run rate. 3 things in the popular telling need correcting. The first is the capital figure. The rise from about $200 billion to about $220 billion is being read purely as a demand signal. It is partly a price signal. Jassy attributed the increase to higher memory costs. At least part of that increase reflects component inflation, rather than additional capacity. Some of the extra money simply pays the higher price of memory, and that same squeeze is about to reach your own hardware quotes. The second is the shape of the demand. The 2 named multi-year, multi-gigawatt commitments to AWS's Trainium chips come from Anthropic and OpenAI. Anthropic is simultaneously one of Amazon's most important AI customers and the source of most of the investment gain behind the group's quarterly net income of $62.6 billion, which included $53.4 billion of non-operating pre-tax income primarily from those investments. That does not invalidate the demand, which is real and contracted, but it means the customer commitment, the cloud revenue, and the investment return should not be treated as three wholly independent signals. The third is the on-premises statistic being passed around as neutral evidence. Jassy says 85% of global IT spending remains on-premises, and his conclusion is that cloud migration has another 10 to 20 years to run. That is the view of a company that sells cloud migration. It is worth knowing and worth discounting accordingly. What matters more than the backlog is the margin, that $16.6 billion of segment operating income on $42.2 billion of revenue is a margin near 39%, up 650 basis points year on year, or 520 stripping out an accounting gain on energy contracts. AWS accelerated growth and expanded margins while the group committed roughly $220 billion to cash capital expenditure this year. Booking demand is easier than serving it profitably while building the factory. Now let me bring this home, because this is where the story stops being about American capital allocation. The scale of Britain's problem has moved faster than the reporting. In February, the connection queue held around 140 data center projects seeking roughly 50 gigawatts. Ofgem's July consultation said contracted demand offers had increased from 41 gigawatts in November 2024 to 125 gigawatts by June 2025, largely driven by data centers, which now account for at least 80 gigawatts. Within the transmission queue, Ofgem identified 315 data center projects, requesting around 73 gigawatts. Great Britain's peak electricity demand, recorded on the 11th of February this year, was 45 gigawatts. Connected data center capacity stands at roughly 2.4 gigawatts. Those are not directly comparable figures, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Requested future load and operational installed. Capacity measured different things on different timescales, but the direction is unmistakable. The contracted demand queue more than tripled between November 2024 and June 2025, and the connection requests from one industry now exceed everything the country draws at its winter peak. The system cannot tell quickly enough which of those projects is real. Of the earlier cohort, 71 projects representing about 20 gigawatts had reported a final investment decision. The remainder had not, which does not mean they lack financing, land or intent, but does leave the operator unable to separate viable developments from projects preserving an option they may never exercise. Ofgem is not sitting still, and the fair version of this criticism has to say so. The regulator is consulting on a data centre commitment fee of £237,500 to £712,500 per megawatt, equivalent to roughly 2.5% to 7.5% of average project costs, refunded on energisation and forfeited on early exit, alongside milestones requiring evidence of financial capability and commercial progress. Earlier reforms on the generation side brought forward 7.8 gigawatts of connections by an average of 6 years. This is not administrative inactivity, but it remains telling that Britain is reforming the allocation of scarcity faster than it is building supply. The market has noticed. In April, OpenAI paused Stargate UK, announced during the Trump state visit with NVIDIA and Nscale, for sites including Cobalt Park in the Northeast AI growth zone, citing energy costs and the regulatory environment. Large-scale Norwegian capacity continued under a different commercial structure. Hydroelectric power was not the only difference between the two, but it was an important one. Britain entered this race with the highest industrial electricity prices among the 24 International Energy Agency countries reporting in 2023, 4 times those of the United States and Canada. Nor are we placed to lecture anyone on building. Hinkley Point C was approved in 2016 at an estimated cost of about £18 billion, with generation expected from 2025. The current estimate is around £35 billion in 2015 prices, nearly £49 billion in current money, with first power targeted for June 2030. Nuclear safety concrete was first poured in 2017. If 2030 holds, first power arrives roughly 13 years after construction began. Set that beside China. It added more than 430 gigawatts of wind and solar last year, taking cumulative wind and solar capacity to 1.84 terawatts, or 47.3% of installed capacity, though those sources delivered 22% of actual generation. It operates 60 reactors and has 36 more under construction, representing more than 49% of nuclear construction worldwide. Between 2012 and 2021, Chinese reactors took an average of 6 years to build, against about 9 globally. But the picture is less one-sided than the capacity figures suggest. Nuclear still supplies less than 5% of Chinese electricity. An analysis published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institutes, The Strategist, argues that the Eastern Data, Western Computing Programme has produced intergovernmental competition, speculative overbuilding and fragmented infrastructure. Beijing reportedly subsidized electricity costs by up to half for some data centers using domestic chips, which suggests the state was having to manufacture demand or offset weaker economics, though it does not by itself prove those centers were idle. Then this month, after months of restricting foreign chips and pressing its technology companies towards domestic alternatives, Beijing has selectively reopened access to limited quantities of H200s. The Financial Times reports that ByteDance and Tencent have each received around 10,000, a claim Reuters has relayed without independently verifying. Blackwell remains restricted, so the map is not the one usually drawn. Western markets have the leading chips, but are increasingly constrained by power and construction. China has built energy infrastructure at extraordinary speed, but has not removed its dependence on advanced foreign silicon. Both have abundance in one part of the stack and scarcity in another. Which brings me to the question I have spent a fortnight on, and the reason this issue exists. For 15 years, the logic of enterprise computing ran one way: do not own the machine, rent it because somebody with more capital and better economies of scale will always own it more cheaply than you can. That argument was correct, and it built the largest businesses in the world. It has not become wrong. It has stopped being automatic. Renting still makes sense for most workloads most of the time, and the realistic answer for almost every business is a mix of frontier APIs, reserved cloud capacity, private cloud, co-location, and for some workloads, owned hardware. What has changed is that the decision now has to be made, rather than assumed, against a supplier who has said plainly that capacity is constrained. We are testing this at Yorkshire AI Labs and sharing the modelling across our portfolio because the companies we back are reaching the same question at the same moment. The numbers are now close enough to justify modelling ownership seriously. They are not close enough to justify announcing a conclusion before the model is built. Start with the hardware, and its most striking feature is how opaque the pricing is. Public market estimates place NVIDIA's DGX B200, an integrated 8-GPU Blackwell system, between roughly $280,000 and $515,000. Comparable estimates put the DGX B300 at about $300,000 to $350,000, and the DGX Station between about $80,000 and $125,000. None of those are official list prices. At the small end sits DGX Spark, a compact Grace Blackwell development machine with 128 gigabytes of unified memory. It launched at $3,999 last October and reached $4,699 by February, a rise NVIDIA attributed to global memory prices. That is the same squeeze that pushed Amazon's capital guidance up by $20 billion, arriving at the other end of the market as a 17.5% increase on a desktop. Those quotations vary enormously, partly because configuration, support, storage, networking, territory, tax, and delivery terms differ, and partly because delivery itself now carries a premium. The same applies to rental. B200 capacity is advertised between roughly $3.35 and $16.11 per GPU hour, although the commitment, service location, and availability differ materially between providers. Price discovery is poor enough that no board should approve a purchase from a headline system price alone. The software is a separate line, and it is the one most business cases miss. NVIDIA AI Enterprise lists at $4,500 per GPU for 1 year, $13,500 for 3 years, or $22,500 per GPU for a perpetual license with 5 years of support. On an 8 GPU system, that is $36,000 a year at list. NVIDIA states that AI enterprise licenses must be purchased separately for Blackwell DGX systems, so while a reseller may fold them into a commercial package, the quotation has to say so explicitly. Do not confuse that license with the hardware support entitlement, which NVIDIA lists as 3 years of enterprise business standard support on the DGX B200. One line in that price list matters to anyone backing startups, qualifying members of NVIDIA's Inception program, and eligible education and research institutions pay $1,125 per GPU per year rather than $4,500. That is a 75% reduction, subject to a cap on how many discounted subscriptions can be bought in a 12-month period. Every eligible portfolio company should check its status before buying anything. Then the building. A complete 8 GPU DGX B200 is rated at approximately 14.3 kilowatts maximum. It is air-cooled, which is not the same as being office equipment. It requires serious electrical provision, heat removal, networking and resilience, paid for at British industrial electricity prices. Owning your compute does not exempt you from the power problem. It relocates it to your building, where you control more of the operating timetable. On the economics, resist anyone offering you a single crossover number, including me. Owned infrastructure can become cheaper once a stable workload keeps it sufficiently busy, but there is no universal token count at which that happens. The answer depends on the model, the quality threshold you will accept, the balance of input and output tokens, batching idle time, latency, redundancy, facilities, staffing, financing, and residual value. Deloitte's modeling found potential savings above 50% over 3 years in some scenarios, while also finding that roughly half the owned cost can sit outside the GPUs, and the metric is not really cost per million tokens, it is cost per successfully completed task at the quality, latency, and reliability the business requires, which is harder to produce and the only figure worth having. The direction of travel is clearer than the arithmetic. Broadcom's vendor-sponsored survey of 1,800 senior IT decision-makers at organizations with at least 1,000 employees suggests production inference is shifting towards private cloud. 56% were running or planning such workloads there, while reported public cloud use for the same category fell from 56% to 41%. Private cloud can be hosted or managed by somebody else, so this is a change in direction rather than a completed migration onto owned racks. 2 operational cautions before anybody signs. DGX Spark is a compact development system, not resilient production infrastructure. Buy it for local development and evaluation, not as the sole machine serving customers. There is also a software boundary worth reading first. Some NVIDIA inference microservices are free on qualifying workstation systems, but fall outside those free terms when used to serve multiple users. That restriction does not cover every local inference stack, so the precise software architecture matters, and the intended deployment should be checked directly with NVIDIA or the reseller rather than assumed. The second is the part I think is most underexplored, and it is the reason we are looking at this at portfolio level rather than company by company. Utilization is one of the variables most likely to decide the answer, and pooling can change it substantially. One machine serving 8 companies is a different financial object from 8 companies each renting badly. A portfolio, a university partnership, or a cluster of firms on one industrial estate can reach a level of use that none of them reaches alone. It also creates an operating company in miniature. Somebody has to provide tenant isolation, scheduling, security, data governance, software licensing, maintenance, chargeback, and service levels. That is a real business with real staff and real liability. Any group considering this should cost the operation, not just the box. So here is what to do about it on Monday morning. 5 things. 1. Measure the workload before the bill. Record tasks per day, input and output tokens, the models used, concurrency, latency requirements, quality thresholds, and peak demand. Those figures anchor everything downstream, and most firms cannot currently produce them. 2. Separate the predictable from the exceptional. Document processing, extraction, classification, and internal search are often stable and high volume. Genuine frontier reasoning is often intermittent and may require models that cannot be run locally. Route accordingly, and the bill can fall before you buy any hardware. 3. Cost the building, not just the box. A DGXB 200 is rated at up to approximately 14.3 kilowatts before networking, storage, and facilities overhead at British industrial electricity prices. Run that before capital approval, not after. 4. Price the license for the deployment you actually intend. Multi-user serving, license terms, and inception eligibility change the recurring cost materially. Get all of it in the written quotation. 5. Own the predictable, rent the exceptional. Hybrid is the destination for almost everyone. The point is to decide it deliberately rather than inherit it. Now, everything I have described so far is a supply-side answer. Build more, buy your own, reserve earlier. All of it is slow and capital hungry. There's a second answer, and it is British. In May, I wrote about Lumai, spun out of the University of Oxford in 2021, after meeting the team at a Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Hub Demo Day. Lumai uses an optical tensor engine to perform some of the core matrix operations in AI with photons rather than conventional electronic computation. Lumai says its optical engine works in three-dimensional volume, allowing many operations to happen simultaneously rather than moving through the two-dimensional layout of a conventional chip. In April, the company launched Iris Nova, which it describes as the first optical computing system to run billion-parameter language models in real time. Lumai says it runs Llama 8B and 70B through a hybrid design, conventional digital processing for control and software alongside the optical engine for the mathematics, and that it is designed to integrate with conventional data center infrastructure rather than requiring a facility to be rebuilt around it. It is available for evaluation, and ARIA has partnered with the company. The headline claim is up to 90% lower energy consumption than conventional GPU architecture. That is a company claim, not an independent benchmark, and it should be read as such. But hold its shape against everything above. Amazon plans roughly $220 billion of cash capital expenditure, and AWS still cannot meet all the demand in front of it. Britain has at least 80 gigawatts of proposed data center demand waiting in the connections queue. A DGXB 200 is rated at approximately 14.3 kilowatts maximum. If the same arithmetic could be done for a fraction of the power, several constraints in this issue loosen at once without pouring a cubic meter of concrete. Two honest caveats. The first is the Jevons paradox. Efficiency gains often stimulate enough additional demand to consume much of the saving. Optical compute is unlikely to end the power problem. It would change who can afford to be in the game, which is different and still valuable. The second is closer to the bone. Britain has form for inventing the future and watching it leave. Our best deep tech companies reach the point of needing serious capital and find that the serious capital speaks with an American accent. Lumai is exactly the kind of asset that cannot be spoken into existence, which is precisely why it could become an acquisition target before Britain has captured the full value. Which brings me to my Yorkshire Post column this week, and it asks where artificial intelligence will eventually reside. The answer is everywhere, because it will become the layer through which we use every machine. The operating system stops being a toolbox and becomes a toolmaker. To see what that does to economics, consider the handsaw. For 2 centuries, a good saw was a serious purchase, and Sheffield made many of the finest. When the teeth dulled, the saw went to a sharpener, or in the works, the saw doctor, who jointed them, reset them, and filed each one back to an edge. The trade existed for one reason: maintaining the tool cost less than replacing it. Then came the hardpoint saw, its teeth hardened by induction, so they held an edge far longer, and no ordinary file would bite. Once a new saw cost less than the skilled hour needed to restore an old one, routine sharpening lost its market. Software is approaching the same line. Every application you own is a sharpenable saw, kept alive by people replacing obsolete libraries and making yesterday's code work on tomorrow's platform. Coding agents are dismantling that bargain because the cost of producing bespoke software is falling towards the cost of describing it. Plenty survives: banks, games, social networks, anything welded to proprietary data, machinery, or hard-won distribution. But a company whose only defense is that its code was hard to write has little defense once the code can be generated. Set that beside everything above, because it is the same argument. Value is draining out of whatever can be produced on demand and pooling in whatever cannot. Nobody speaks a gigawatt a grid connection, a proprietary data set, or 8 Blackwell chips in a rack into existence. The durable assets are physical, contractual, and slow, which is exactly the category Britain has spent 40 years treating as somebody else's problem. Cheap saws did not stop anyone cutting wood. AI will not kill software. It will kill the assumption that all software must be packaged and maintained as a product. And the question for every business is what it controls that could not be spoken into existence before lunch. Now to the layoff tracker, covering the 15th to the 21st of August, with figures as at Friday the 21st, the milestone first. Layoffs.fyi recorded 122,606 tech job losses across 278 companies in the whole of 2025. The 2026 running total now stands at 126,488. This year passed last year's entire 12 months sometime in early August, with 4 months still to run. And it did so with fewer employers cutting deeper. 6 reductions have moved the August numbers, 1,442 roles between them. All 6 are dated to their announcement and already sit inside that running total. Zillow, 500 plus roles in property technology, an organizational restructuring covering roughly 7% of the workforce. Rapid7, 300 roles in cybersecurity, a 12% reduction announced while raising full-year profit guidance. Sanofi, 229 roles in biotech, post-acquisition integration following the $9.1 billion Blueprint Medicines deal. Etsy, 220 roles in e-commerce, roughly 12% of staff, mostly product and engineering. Salesforce, 133 roles in enterprise CRM, 59 in Bellevue and Seattle, 74 in San Francisco. And Pantera, 60 roles, reported as an AI-driven adjustment, carried but not independently confirmed. A separate group reached its legal effective date this week. 394 e-commerce and technology roles at Walmart in California, 244 finance roles at JP Morgan Chase in Texas, 136 at Lucid Motors in California, and 91 at Fortrex. Those workers came off payroll this week, but the cuts were announced earlier in the summer and counted then. I am listing them and excluding them from every total, because counting a job when it is announced and again when it ends is how trackers inflate. Now, the pattern is not the one the headlines describe. These are not failing companies. Etsy cut about 12% of its workforce in the same quarter. Its income from continuing operations rose to $114.3 million from $45.6 million. And the cuts landed on the product and engineering teams that had just delivered the result. Rapid7 cut 12% while raising its profit outlook. Cisco eliminated close to 4,000 roles in a quarter of record revenue. Cloudflare cut around 1,100 people, roughly a fifth of its staff. In the same week, it reported 34% annual revenue growth. Microsoft is the cleanest illustration, and it belongs in the analysis rather than the weekly table, because that cut was announced on the 6th of July. It eliminated 4,800 roles, 2.1% of its workforce, with the Xbox division hardest hit at 1,600 immediately and around 3,200 across the financial year. In the same period, it projected roughly $190 billion of infrastructure and data center spending for 2026, against big technology AI outlays reported as likely to top $700 billion this year. Then follow the money one step further than anyone else has. A surge in memory prices driven by data center demand forced Microsoft to raise Xbox console prices by $100 to $150 worldwide. That is the same squeeze that pushed Amazon's capital guidance up by $20 billion and put 17.5% on the price of a desktop development machine. hyperscaler capital expenditure, an enterprise hardware quote, and a games console on a shop shelf, all moved by one component shortage in one quarter. If you want a single fact that explains why compute has stopped behaving like a utility, it is that one. Two chief executives have now declined the automation excuse, and the difference between their refusals matters. Etsy's Kruti Patel Goyal told staff the decisions were not driven by AI at all, attributing them to an organizational design the company already knew needed changing. Microsoft's chief people officer, Amy Coleman, was narrower, writing that the eliminated roles are not being replaced by AI, while accepting that AI is changing how work gets done. Etsy rejected the cause, Microsoft rejected the mechanism and accepted the cause. That is not one pattern yet. It is a formula being drafted in public, and it is worth watching which version becomes standard, because the honest answer in most of these cases is neither. The money is moving from payroll to concrete. Set that beside the top of this issue. Amazon plans to spend roughly $220 billion this year on capacity it cannot build fast enough. The companies queuing to rent that capacity are, in the same quarter, cutting staff from profitable businesses. Record capital is going into compute, while the headcount that compute was meant to augment comes out. Whatever that is, it is not yet a productivity story. It is a substitution story wearing a productivity story's clothes. And so, to my final thought. For 15 years, we were told to stop owning things. Do not own the servers, do not own the software, do not own the building, rent it all from somebody with better economies of scale, and put the capital into growth instead. It was good advice, and it made fortunes. That advice has not been repealed, it has been qualified, and Amazon read out the qualification on the 30th of July. When the landlord cannot house every tenant who wants a room, tenancy stops being a decision you can leave unmade. Britain's answer is a queue. China's is to selectively reopen access to the American chips it spent months restricting. Amazon's is to commit roughly $220 billion of cash capital expenditure, much of it to the infrastructure beneath AI and cloud. The firms selling the rented future are spending record sums to own what sits beneath it. So here is the question I would put to any board in this country. When compute is constrained, what does your business control that a supplier cannot ration away? A machine in your own building, guaranteed capacity, a proprietary data set, a grid connection with your name on it, a customer relationship no competitor can rent. If the honest answer is nothing, your strategy depends on somebody else's queue. That is the Sunday Signal, issue 68. Thank you for listening. If this was useful, please share it with one person who is about to sign a cloud contract, or one person who sits on a board that has never discussed a grid connection. The full newsletter with every figure sourced and the complete layoff tracker is free at theSundaySignal.ai. And please do follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube, and leave a rating if you have 30 seconds. It makes the algorithm work for us rather than against us. Until next Sunday, I am David Richards. Thank you for listening to the Sunday Signal.